In 1980, two researchers rented a penthouse apartment on Manhattan's East Side. They hired gourmet food designers. They laid out 4 types of pâté, 3 kinds of caviar, a case of vintage Bordeaux, and a case of 1973 Cabernet Sauvignon. The room was perfect. The menu was perfect. They were about to interview a group of millionaires, people worth at least $10 million, and they wanted everything to feel right. The first man walked in. His name was Mr. Budd. He wore a well-worn suit and an overcoat that looked like it had seen better decades. One of the researchers smiled and said, "Mr. Budd, may I pour you a glass of 1970 Bordeaux?" Mr. Budd looked at him with a puzzled expression, and then he said something that would change how these researchers understood wealth for the rest of their lives. Over the next 2 hours, 9 millionaires sat in that room, and not a single one of them touched the pâté. They drank no wine. They ate only the crackers. And what the researchers learned in that apartment became the foundation of one of the most important books ever written about money in America. Welcome back to One Book Away. Today we're unpacking The Millionaire Next Door by Thomas Stanley and William Danko, a book that, since 1996, has quietly rewired the financial lives of millions of people. It's based on over 20 years of surveys and face-to-face interviews with more than 500 American millionaires, and what it reveals is so contrary to what most of us believe about wealth that it almost feels like a trick. Because here's the premise: the people you think are rich, the ones with the luxury cars and the circular driveways and the designer watches, most of them are not actually rich. They're performing rich. They're one bad quarter away from collapse. And the people who are genuinely wealthy, the ones who could walk away from their jobs tomorrow and never work again, they're almost invisible. They live next door to you. You stand behind them in line at the hardware store. You would never ever guess. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through every key idea in this book. The formula that tells you in 10 seconds whether you're actually wealthy. The 7 habits that all self-made millionaires share. Why frugality is the single strongest predictor of net worth. Why education and high income can actually sabotage your wealth. And why giving money to your adult children may be quietly destroying their financial future. By the end, you're going to see the people around you differently. And more importantly, you're going to see yourself differently. Let's begin where the researchers began, with the great illusion. The great illusion. Before they wrote this book, Thomas Stanley and William Danko spent years interviewing the affluent from major financial institutions. Banks, trust companies, investment firms, they all wanted to understand who the wealthy were because they wanted to sell to them. And for years, Stanley and Danko had the same assumption everyone else had. Wealthy people live in big houses, they wear expensive suits, they drink expensive wine, they act, look, and sound like the image our culture has drilled into every one of us since childhood. And then one morning in June of 1980, Stanley sat down in a task force meeting with a Harvard-trained mathematician named John Robin. John had just finished profiling the wealth characteristics of over 200,000 neighborhoods across America, and he said, almost in passing, one sentence that stopped Stanley cold: about half of the millionaires in America don't live in upscale neighborhoods. Stop and let that sink in for a moment. Half, not a sliver, not a rounding error. Half of American millionaires live in middle-class, even working-class neighborhoods. They live in homes with vinyl siding. They mow their own lawns. Their neighbors are postal workers, firefighters, and mechanics. And these people, these invisible millionaires, are the ones Stanley would spend the next 3 decades of his career studying. There's a phrase wealthy Texans use to describe people who look rich but aren't. They call them big hat, no cattle. Stanley first heard it from a 35-year-old Texan who owned a very successful business rebuilding large diesel engines. This man drove a 10-year-old car. He wore jeans and a buckskin shirt. His house was in a lower middle-class area, and his neighbors were postal clerks and firemen. When his British business partners first came to visit him, They walked into his office, looked around, and assumed he was one of the truck drivers. The senior British partner eventually said, "Oh, we forgot we were in Texas," and the Texan told Stanley with a grin, "I don't own big hats, but I have a lot of cattle." That phrase, "big hat, no cattle," is the entire book in 5 words, because most of the people wearing the biggest hats, driving the flashiest cars, living in the largest houses, wearing the most expensive watches, they have no cattle. Their lifestyle is the wealth. Take away the income for 6 months, and the whole picture collapses. Meanwhile, the real millionaires? Consider a couple Stanley profiled in his preface. He calls them Miss T and her husband. Their combined net worth puts them firmly in millionaire territory. Her husband's watch is a Seiko, which happens to be the most common brand among American millionaires. Her watch is a Timex. They buy their clothes at Dillard's, JCPenney, and TJ Maxx. In the past 10 years, they've purchased exactly 2 cars, both Fords. Their home is worth about $275,000. Miss T's most recent haircut cost her $18. When people hear about couples like this, the first question is almost always the same. But are they happy? Here's what the research shows. 90% of millionaires who live in homes worth under $300,000 are extremely satisfied with their lives. Not just content, extremely satisfied. In fact, there are nearly 3 times as many million-dollar households living in homes worth under $300,000 as there are living in homes worth over $1 million. Stop and think about that. The people living in the mansions, for the most part, aren't the millionaires. The millionaires are in the modest houses, and the people in the mansions are often living a beautiful, visible, exhausting financial lie. So why does this illusion persist? Why do we all almost instinctively picture wealth as a lifestyle rather than a balance sheet? Because we've been trained. Hollywood shows us the mansion. Advertising shows us the luxury car. Social media shows us the vacation. And somewhere along the way, we absorbed a very particular idea that wealthy people consume wealthily, that the way you know someone is rich is that they live expensively. And so to feel rich, or to appear rich, or to prove to ourselves that we're doing well in life, we start consuming in the pattern we associate with wealth. We buy the bigger house, the nicer car, the designer label, and in the process, we guarantee we'll never actually be rich, because every dollar you spend trying to look wealthy is a dollar you can't invest in actually becoming wealthy. That's the trade, and most people don't even realize they're making it. Stanley puts it this way: it's much easier to purchase products that denote superiority than to be actually superior in economic achievement. Read that twice. Allocating your time and money to looking superior has a very predictable outcome: inferior economic achievement. So if wealth isn't about the house or the car or the watch, what is it about? How do you actually tell whether someone is rich? How do you tell whether you are? There's a formula for that, and it's simpler than you might expect. Chapter 2, The Wealth Formula. Here's a thought experiment. I'm going to give you the names and basic financial facts of 2 men, and I want you to tell me which one is wealthy. Man number 1 is named Charles Bobbins. He's 41 years old. He's a fireman. His wife is a secretary. Their combined annual income is $55,000. Their net worth is $460,000. Man number 2 is Dr. John Ashton. He's 56 years old. He's a physician. His annual income is approximately $560,000. His net worth is $1.1 million. So, which of them is wealthy? If you answered Dr. Ashton, you're answering the way almost everyone answers. He's a millionaire. He out-earns the fireman 10 to 1. He has more than twice the net worth. Case closed. But according to Thomas Stanley, you'd be wrong, because Stanley argues that wealth isn't an absolute number. Wealth is a ratio. It's the relationship between what you earn and what you've kept. And when you measure it that way, the fireman is wealthy and the doctor is broke. Here's the formula Stanley developed after years of surveying high-income and high-net-worth Americans. Take your age, multiply it by your total annual pre-tax income from all sources, excluding any inheritances. Divide by 10. That number is what your net worth should be. Let me walk through it. Charles Bobbins, the fireman, is 41. His household earns $55,000. 41 times 55,000 is $2,255,000. Divide by 10. That's $225,500. That's what someone in his income and age bracket should have. But Charles Bobbins has $460,000. He's sitting at more than double what he should have. He's not just on track, he's crushing it. Stanley would call him a PAW, a prodigious accumulator of wealth. Now let's run Dr. Ashton, 56 years old, earning $560,000 a year. 56 times 560,000 is $31,360,000. Divide by 10. That's $3,136,000. That's what he should be worth, but he's worth $1.1 million. He's at about a third of where he should be. He's what Stanley calls a UAW, an under-accumulator of wealth, despite being a millionaire, despite earning more than $500,000 a year. And here's the question that cuts the deepest. If Dr. Ashton lost his job tomorrow, if the income stopped, how long could he sustain his family's lifestyle? 2 years, maybe 3. The fireman, on the other hand, with a fraction of the income, could sustain his family for over a decade without working a single day. Who really is the wealthy one? This is the framework that sits at the center of the entire book. PAW or UAW, prodigious accumulator of wealth, or under-accumulator. And what makes it so powerful is that it removes income from the wealth equation almost entirely. It doesn't matter how much you make. It matters what you keep. It matters what you build. Stanley pushes this concept even further with what might be the single most memorable case study in the book. He calls them Dr. North and Dr. South, and they are the perfect illustration of what two very different relationships with money look like at the exact same income level. Picture two surgeons, same age, mid-50s, same family size, both married with 4 children, same medical specialty, same city. Last year, both of them earned more than $700,000. On paper, these two men are almost clones, but in reality, they are living in two entirely different worlds. Dr. South, despite earning $700,000 a year, is afraid. He's worried about having to reduce his family's standard of living. He's worried about his income not being high enough to support the way his family spends. His net worth, despite his enormous salary, is in real terms declining year over year. He spends a lot. He invests little. If his income stopped for even 6 months, his financial world would come apart. Dr. North, on the other hand, is free. He has the same income as Dr. South, same specialty, same family, but he's not afraid. He's not worried about his standard of living. He's not concerned about his next quarter. He's a prodigious accumulator of wealth, and he could stop working tomorrow and live comfortably for decades. So what's the difference? Stanley breaks it down across dozens of data points throughout the book, but here's the core of it. Dr. South spends his money on the outward appearance of success: expensive cars, a large home in a prestigious neighborhood, private clubs, luxury vacations, designer goods. His life is a performance of affluence. Dr. North drives a modest car. He lives in a nice but unremarkable home. He spends his weekends with his family, not at the country club. He plans his budget. He tracks his investments. He builds methodically year after year, while his twin across town spends visibly year after year. And here's what's astonishing. Both of them earn more than virtually any American will ever earn in their lifetime. They are top tier earners, and yet one of them is genuinely rich, and the other is a very well-paid performer playing the role of rich. This is why income and wealth are not the same thing. You can earn $1 million a year and be poor. You can earn $55,000 a year and be wealthy. What matters isn't the number on your paycheck. It's the gap between what you earn and what you keep, and how intentionally you close that gap every single year. Run the formula on yourself. Right now, in your head, age times income divided by 10. Is that roughly what you're worth? Or is the real number far lower than it should be? For most people who run this math for the first time, the answer is humbling. But here's the good news. The habits that separate Dr. North from Dr. South aren't talents. They aren't inherited. They aren't even particularly difficult. They're decisions. Small, repeated, unglamorous decisions. And the first of those decisions, the one that runs underneath everything else, starts with a single word. Actually, it starts with 3, and they're the same word repeated 3 times. Chapter 3. Frugal, frugal, frugal. Back in 1980, after the Manhattan pâté incident, Thomas Stanley learned something that would reshape his entire career. The Millionaires didn't want the wine. They didn't want the caviar. They wanted coffee and club sandwiches. And in every subsequent interview he conducted, across decades and across hundreds of respondents, the same truth kept surfacing over and over in dozens of different forms. If you want the shortest possible description of how American millionaires actually live, Stanley narrows it down to 3 words: frugal, frugal, frugal. Now I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, great, another book telling me to clip coupons and skip the latte. But this isn't that. This is something deeper. Because frugality in Stanley's research isn't a sacrifice. It isn't a deprivation. It isn't even really about saving money, at least not in the way most personal finance books frame it. Frugality, for the Millionaire Next Door, is a stance. It's a relationship with consumption. It's the quiet internal rule that says, I will not let the number on my paycheck determine the size of my life. And the statistics Stanley gathered on how these people actually spend are frankly astonishing. Let's start with suits, because suits in American corporate life are the clearest signal we have of this person has arrived. So what does the typical American millionaire pay for the most expensive suit he has ever purchased in his entire life? Not the most expensive suit he owns right now, the most expensive suit he's ever bought in any year for any reason. $399. That's the median. Half of all American millionaires in Stanley's survey reported that they never in their entire lives spent more than $399 on a suit. 1 in 4 paid $285 or less. 1 in 10 paid less than $195. And only 1 in 100 ever paid over $2,800. And for the self-made millionaires, the ones who didn't inherit, those numbers were even lower. The typical self-made millionaires paid about $360 for his most expensive suit ever. Now here's the question. If millionaires aren't buying the $1,000 suits, who is? Stanley found something striking in the data. For every American millionaire who owns a $1,000 suit, there are at least 6 people wearing $1,000 suits who are not millionaires, who earn between $50,000 and $200,000 a year, but have a net worth that doesn't even come close. These are the people stocking the high-end department stores, corporate middle managers, attorneys, marketing executives, physicians, people who've been trained by their profession and by our culture to believe that their clothes must signal their status. The millionaires, meanwhile, are shopping at JCPenney. In fact, over 30% of the millionaire respondents in Stanley's survey carried a JCPenney credit card. Let that sink in. Almost a third of American millionaires have a store card for the place most people associate with the working class. And it's not just suits, it's watches, it's cars, it's homes, it's shoes, it's everything. The pattern is the same across every category. The wealthy as a group spend dramatically less than their incomes would allow. The non-wealthy spend in a way that performs the lifestyle their incomes can't sustain. But Stanley doesn't stop it. They spend less. He goes deeper. He asks the harder question. What specifically, in the daily life of a millionaire, creates this pattern? And he finds something most personal finance advice completely misses: Millionaire's budget. In his survey, Stanley asked millionaire after millionaire about their household planning habits. And what he found was that for every 100 millionaires who don't actively budget, there are 120 who do. Most millionaires, the actual wealthy ones, sit down on a regular basis and plan out where their money goes. They know what they earn, they know what they spend, they know what they're investing. They've tracked it on paper or on a spreadsheet for years. Compare that to the typical high-income non-millionaire. Stanley's research found that people in the upper income brackets who aren't wealthy almost universally share one habit. They let their income define their budget. They don't plan, they spend what comes in. If income goes up, spending goes up with it. If income doubles, lifestyle doubles with it. There's no gap, there's no margin, there's no accumulation. And here's where it gets really interesting. When Stanley asked millionaires, "Why do you budget when you're already wealthy? Why do you still track every category of spending?" The answer he got, repeatedly, was some version of this: "We became millionaires by budgeting and controlling expenses, and we maintain our status the same way." Budgeting didn't come after the wealth. Budgeting created the wealth, and they never stopped doing it because they understood at a deep level that the habit and the outcome were the same thing. One millionaire woman, a former engineer, told Stanley a story that captures this perfectly. She said, "After college, my husband and I both got good jobs. We're both engineers. We lived on one income and saved the other. Anytime we got raises, we just saved more. We've lived in the same modest 1,900 square foot home for 20 years. And then she added, "Sometimes my kids ask if we're poor because I make them order from the $1 value menu." Read that story twice. Her kids, the children of two engineers with a 7-figure net worth, wonder if they're poor because mom makes them order off the value menu at fast food restaurants. That's not a family that's suffering. That's a family that understood generations ago that the value menu and the 7-figure net worth are not a coincidence. They are a cause and effect. Now, I want to be careful here because there's a version of this message that sounds like be cheap, hate yourself, never enjoy anything. That is not what Stanley is saying. That's not what the millionaires in his data are doing. They take vacations. They send their kids to college. They eat well. They have hobbies. The frugality isn't joyless. It's just directed. It's aimed. They spend lavishly on the handful of things they actually care about, and they spend almost nothing on the things they don't, especially on anything whose primary purpose is to signal status to other people, because that's the core distinction. The millionaire next door is willing to look poor in order to be rich. The under-accumulator of wealth is willing to be poor in order to look rich. Those are two completely different lives, disguised as the same life. And this brings us to maybe the most visible arena where this plays out. The one thing almost every American uses, consciously or not, to signal economic status. The car in your driveway. Chapter 4. You aren't what you drive. A few years into his research, Thomas Stanley interviewed a man we'll just call Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen was what Stanley calls a super PO, a super prodigious accumulator of wealth. He'd built his fortune the old-fashioned way. He owned a manufacturing plant in an old industrial area. He was the kind of wealthy where most of his employees had no idea just how wealthy he actually was. And one day, Mr. Allen received word that several of his business associates, grateful for the help he'd given them over the years keeping their companies afloat, had decided to buy him a birthday present, a Rolls Royce. They'd ordered it 4 months earlier. It had a special color, a special interior. They hadn't told Mr. Allen. It was going to be a surprise. 5 months from the delivery date, one of the most extravagant gifts a group of friends could possibly give. When Mr. Allen found out about the Rolls-Royce, he had a problem, because Mr. Allen didn't want it, and he had to figure out how to tell them. Stanley asked him why. Why refuse a Rolls-Royce? What possible reason could someone have to turn down that kind of gift? And the answer Mr. Allen gave is, in my opinion, one of the most perfect windows into the Millionaire Next Door mindset in the entire book. He said, "There's nothing the Rolls-Royce represents that's important in my life, nor would I want to have to change my life to go along with owning the Rolls." And then he started listing in detail all the specific ways the Rolls-Royce would have forced him to change. "I can't throw fish in the back seat of the Rolls like I do right now when I go fishing. I'm out fishing here every weekend. We have some of the best freshwater fishing in the country, right out where I keep my fishing boat." The Rolls-Royce would have cost him his fishing, because you don't throw bloody fish into the leather interior of a Rolls-Royce. You just don't. The whole lifestyle that the car implied, the clean clothes, the careful parking, the protected interior, was incompatible with the lifestyle Mr. Allen actually loved. And he went further. He said the Rolls would look out of place at his factory, which was in an old industrial area. His workers would notice. They might start to feel like their boss was exploiting them. How else could he afford such an expensive vehicle? The car would introduce tension into his entire working environment. And then he added one more thing, almost offhand. He said, "With a Rolls, I can't go to some of the crummy restaurants I enjoy going to. Can't drive up in a Rolls-Royce, so no thank you." That's the whole book in a single paragraph. The crummy restaurants, the fishing, the factory, the workers, none of which the Rolls-Royce would accommodate. Because Mr. Allen understood something most people never understand. Products change people. That's the principle Stanley draws out from this story. It's so simple, but it takes decades for most of us to see it. When you buy a status product, you don't just buy the product. You buy a whole complementary lifestyle that the product demands. The luxury car comes with the house in the right neighborhood. The right neighborhood comes with the right schools. The right schools come with the right clubs. The right clubs come with the right vacations. Before long, the entire architecture of your life has been rearranged to support that first purchase, and you didn't choose it. The purchase chose it. Mr. Allen refused to let that happen. He understood at the deepest level that his simple, efficient, fishing on the weekends, factory in the industrial area life was worth more to him than any luxury car could ever be, and that accepting the gift would have meant trading the life he loved for a life he'd have to perform. Now, Mr. Allen is an extreme example, but the pattern he's naming is everywhere in Stanley's data. Let's look at what the average American millionaire actually drives. Only about 23% of millionaires in Stanley's survey owned a current model year car. That means more than 3 out of 4 millionaires are driving a car that is at least 1 model year old, often considerably older. 25% hadn't purchased a car in 4 or more years. 42%, nearly half, held on to their cars for more than 6 years before replacing them. How much did they pay for these cars? The typical millionaire paid $24,800 for his most recent car. 30% paid less than $19,500, and crucially, more than half of all American millionaires in the survey never in their entire lives paid more than $30,000 for any motor vehicle, ever. Stop and compare that to what you see on the road today. The $60,000 SUVs, the $80,000 luxury sedans, the $100,000 performance cars. Who do you think is buying those? It's almost never the millionaires, because the millionaires did the math decades ago and realized that the depreciation on a luxury vehicle, the thousands of dollars that evaporate the moment you drive it off the lot, is one of the most efficient wealth destroyers ever invented. Stanley gives us a perfect side-by-side to illustrate this. It comes back to our two surgeons, Dr. North and Dr. South. Dr. South, who you'll remember earns over $700,000 a year and is genuinely afraid of his own finances, spent more than $70,000 on his most recent car purchase, including taxes and insurance. It was a Porsche, and he was proud of how he'd bought it. He'd spent more than 60 hours negotiating. He'd called low-price dealers. He'd waited until the end of the month when dealers had sales quotas to hit. He'd played them against each other. He'd gotten, in his own mind, an incredible deal. But here's what Stanley noticed. In the same year, Dr. South spent $70,000 on his Porsche. He contributed $5,700 to his pension plan. Just $1 in every 125 of his income went toward retirement. He spent 60 hours getting the best possible price on an extremely expensive car. He spent almost no time on the thing that would actually build his long-term wealth. His actions, as Stanley puts it, spoke louder than his words. Now Dr. North, also a surgeon, also $700,000 a year. When Stanley interviewed him about his most recent car, Dr. North said, "I bought it 6 years ago." 6 years ago. Before that car, he'd driven the same car for 20 years. 20. When he finally replaced it, he bought a 3-year-old Mercedes for $35,000. He paid cash. He never finances. He never leases. He explained his reasoning to Stanley with one of the cleanest rationales in the whole book. He said, "I asked myself a simple question. Is the pride of new car ownership, and that's all it is, pride, worth $20,000? The cars are the same. The answer is no. The cars are the same. The answer is no." 2 sentences. $20,000 saved. Over a lifetime of car purchases, those decisions compound into hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars of additional wealth. And here's the part Stanley really wants you to see. Dr. North didn't just save money on his car, he saved time. His entire car buying process took a few hours. He replaced a car once every 20-something years. Dr. South, meanwhile, spent 60 hours on a single transaction, and he does it frequently because he likes to drive newer models. On average, Dr. North spends less than an hour a year thinking about cars. Dr. South spent the equivalent of an entire work week shopping for a single vehicle. And that time, multiplied across decades, across dozens of purchases, across the 60-hour crusades, that time is wealth. It's hours that could have been spent with family, reading, investing, building a business, resting, which raises a question that runs much deeper than cars. What do wealthy people actually do with their time? How do they allocate their hours? Because the patterns Stanley finds are not what most of us assume. And it turns out, the wealthy don't just budget their money differently. They budget their time differently. They budget their energy differently. They budget their attention differently. And that, more than almost anything else in their lives, is what separates them from everyone else. Chapter 5. Time, Energy, and Money. If you could stand outside the homes of Dr. North and Dr. South on an average Tuesday evening and watch what each man actually does with his free hours, you would see 2 completely different lives. Dr. South, after a long day at the hospital, comes home. He has dinner with his family. He watches some television. He might review a few investment statements his financial advisor sent him. He rarely reads them closely. When he thinks about money, it's usually because he's thinking about what to buy next. The next car, the next vacation, the next upgrade to the house. Money, for Dr. South, is a river flowing in one direction, toward the next purchase. Dr. North, after his long day at the hospital, also comes home, also has dinner with his family, also watches some television. But once a week, maybe twice, Dr. North sits down at his desk and spends an hour or 2 on a ritual that looks almost boring from the outside. He reviews his investments. He reads financial statements carefully. He makes decisions about what to hold, what to shift, what to add. He tracks his net worth. He plans. That small difference, that 1 or 2 hours repeated weekly over decades, is one of the largest wealth-creating habits in Thomas Stanley's entire dataset, and the numbers behind it are striking. Stanley surveyed middle-income PAWs and UAWs, people making roughly the same income, around $50,000 a year, and asked them a simple question: how many hours per month do you spend planning your investments? The PAWs, the wealth builders, reported spending an average of 8.4 hours per month on investment planning, about 100 hours per year. The UAWs, the under-accumulators, spent 4.6 hours per month, about 55 hours per year. That's almost double, 83% more planning time, month after month, year after year. Now on the surface, that doesn't sound like a huge difference, does it? 4 extra hours a month? That's 1 hour a week. That's the time it takes to watch a sitcom with commercials. But here's what that 1 hour a week compounds into. The PAWs in Stanley's study, at the same income as their UAW counterparts, had an average net worth of $629,000. The UAWs had a net worth of $105,000. Same income, same age range, roughly the same career prospects, 6 times the wealth. And the single biggest behavioral difference Stanley found between the two groups was how they allocated their planning hours. Now I want to be careful here. Stanley himself pushes back on an obvious interpretation. He says, if you're a UAW and you just double your planning time, you don't automatically become a PAW. It doesn't work that way. Planning is one ingredient, not the whole recipe. But what he does emphasize is the consistency of it. The PAW in his study weren't planning in bursts. They weren't doing January budgeting sprints and then forgetting about it until December. They had a regimented schedule. Each week, each month, each year, they sat down and they planned. And this is where Stanley introduces one of the most clarifying analogies in the whole book. He compares the UAW approach to money to someone trying to lose weight through extreme diets. You know the pattern. Someone decides in a flash of motivation that they're going to completely transform their body. They starve themselves, they cut out every indulgence, they lose some weight, and then inevitably, the extreme restriction breaks. They rebound and they regain all the weight and more. That's what UAWs do with money. Every January, they sit down with enthusiasm and write out ambitious investment goals. They vow to cut spending dramatically. They talk about the new financial person they're going to become. And by March, the whole thing has collapsed. They're back to spending the way they always did, because the lifestyle they tried to impose on themselves was never sustainable in the first place. PAWs, on the other hand, don't diet. They've simply built a sustainable relationship with their money. A relationship that doesn't require constant willpower, because the structure does the work. The budget exists, the weekly review exists, the long-term plan exists. They don't have to decide, in every individual moment, whether to save or spend. The system has already decided, and they just follow it. And underneath all of this planning behavior, Stanley finds something even more fundamental: goals. Stanley once interviewed a decamillionaire, a man worth over $10 million, who had started a wholesale food business at the age of 19. He'd never finished high school. He'd eventually gotten his equivalency diploma, but formal education was not his path. Stanley asked him straight up, how did a high school dropout accumulate $10 million? And the man said, I have always been goal-oriented. I have a clearly defined set of daily goals, weekly goals, monthly goals, annual goals, and lifetime goals. I even have goals to go to the bathroom. I always tell our young executives that they must have goals. And that last line is a little funny, a little intense, but it captures something real. For every 100 millionaires Stanley surveyed who did not set clear goals, there were 180 who did. The wealthy are overwhelmingly goal-driven people, and the goals are not vague. They are specific. They are measurable. They are written down. They are broken into time horizons, from the next 24 hours to the next 20 years. And importantly, the goals are not about what to consume. They're about what to build. Dr. South had a 20-year goal of maintaining a certain lifestyle. Dr. North had a 20-year goal of accumulating a certain level of financial freedom. Same income, same profession, completely different targets, and so completely different outcomes. Now there's a darker side to the time and energy question, and Stanley doesn't shy away from it. He looks at Dr. South and he identifies something Dr. South is actively worried about. In a way, Dr. North is not, and it's not money exactly. It's his children. Dr. South told Stanley that he has real, pressing fears about his adult children. He's afraid they think his wealth is their income. He's afraid he'll have to financially support them indefinitely. He's afraid they'll fight over his estate. He's afraid he'll be accused of favoring one over the other. He is, in short, afraid that the lifestyle he gave his children has built them into adults who cannot sustain themselves without him. Dr. North has none of these fears because his children grew up in a household that was frugal, planned, disciplined. They watched their father make careful financial decisions. They watched their mother budget. They learned that money is something you build, not something you consume. And so, as adults, they are economically self-sufficient. They don't ask dad for help. They don't expect an inheritance to rescue them. They live their own lives on their own terms. And here's what Stanley finds. Looking at hundreds of families, PAWs tend to produce PAWs. UAWs tend to produce UAWs. The way you live your financial life in front of your children is the way they will live theirs. The dining room table, the family conversation about money or the absence of it, the car in the driveway, the pressure to consume, all of it teaches, every single year, whether you intend it to or not, which means the time and energy question isn't just about your own wealth. It's about whose financial patterns you are currently installing in the next generation. Your choices this decade are your children's defaults next decade. That's a weighty thought, and it leads us directly into maybe the most counterintuitive chapter in the entire book. Because most parents, when they finally do start accumulating wealth, have an instinct about what to do with it. And that instinct, Stanley argues, is almost always wrong. Chapter 6. Economic Outpatient Care. Let me introduce you to a couple. Stanley calls them Lamar and Mary. On paper, Lamar and Mary look like they're doing well. They live in a beautiful home in an upscale neighborhood. Their children attend private school. Lamar drives a luxury car. Mary drives an SUV that costs more than most Americans make in a year. They take family vacations to Europe. Their friends assume reasonably that they must be quite successful, and in a way they are. Their lifestyle is expensive, maintained, and visibly prosperous, but there's something the friends don't know. Lamar and Mary's actual income would not remotely sustain their lifestyle. Their expenses in a typical year exceed what they earn by a significant margin. They have never sat down and made a budget. They don't track their spending. They don't plan for retirement in any meaningful way. And every year, they quietly, reliably spend more than they bring in. So how do they survive? How does this lifestyle continue year after year without collapse? Because every year, Mary's parents give them money, a lot of it in the form of cash gifts, paid medical and dental expenses for the grandchildren, tuition for the private schools, down payments, birthday checks, Christmas bonuses, emergency rescues. The gifts are steady, substantial, and structural. Mary and Lamar's entire lifestyle rests on them. Stanley gives this phenomenon a name. He calls it economic outpatient care, or EOC, and it is, he argues, one of the most destructive forces in American wealth building today, precisely because it wears the disguise of love. Now, before you hear this as an attack on generous parents, let me be clear about what Stanley is actually claiming. EOC is not about occasional gifts. It's not about helping your kids through a crisis. It's not about covering a wedding, or paying for your grandchild's summer camp, or pitching in when someone loses a job. What Stanley is talking about is sustained, substantial, structural financial support. Money that props up a standard of living the recipient could not otherwise afford. Money that year after year prevents the adult child from ever having to face the reality of their own financial situation. And here's what the data shows. It's one of the cleanest findings in the entire book. Stanley studied thousands of affluent families across his career, and he consistently found that, adjusting for all other factors, income, education, occupation, age, the adult children who received the most economic outpatient care had significantly less wealth than the adult children who received the least. The more gifts you get, the less you accumulate. The fewer gifts you get, the more you build. And this is not a small effect. In his surveys, the gap between gift receivers and non-receivers at similar income levels was substantial. Why does this happen? You might think the opposite would be true. If someone gives you $100,000, shouldn't you be $100,000 wealthier? Shouldn't gifts just boost your net worth? In reality, they almost never do. Because the moment you start receiving sustained EOC, 3 things happen to your financial life, all of them bad. First, your lifestyle adjusts upward to match what the gifts allow. You buy a bigger house, a nicer car. You enroll your kids in better schools. You vacation in better places. Your baseline cost of living rises to meet the gifts, and now you need the gifts just to sustain it. The gifts have stopped being bonuses. They've become load-bearing beams in your budget. Second, your financial discipline atrophies. Stanley found that adult children who receive regular EOC are much less likely to budget, much less likely to plan, much less likely to save, and much less likely to make careful spending decisions. They have no reason to. The safety net is there. Why sweat the math when dad will cover it? Third, and this one's subtle but devastating, your relationship with money becomes emotional and dependent rather than competent and independent. You never develop the muscle of actually being financially self-sufficient because you've never had to use it. You reach 40, 50, sometimes 60 years old, and you still don't know at a gut level what it feels like to fully fund your own life. Stanley says it with one sentence that has stayed with me since I first read it. It is much easier to spend other people's money than dollars that are self-generated. And this explains why the adult children of wealthy families so often live lifestyles that look expensive but feel hollow. They have the house, the car, the vacations, but they don't have the underlying security. They're one canceled gift away from crisis. They know it. Their parents know it. And often nobody wants to talk about it because the money is wrapped in the language of love. The statistics here are blunt. More than 46% of affluent Americans give at least $15,000 a year in EOC to their adult children or grandchildren. Nearly half of adult children under 35, born to affluent parents, receive regular cash gifts, and about 1 in 5 adult children in their mid-40s to mid-50s are still receiving them. Let that last number register for a moment. 1 in 5 adult children in their 50s are still getting cash from their parents, 50 years old, and still not fully financially grown up. Stanley found something even more striking when he compared what gift givers reported versus what gift receivers reported. The givers consistently reported giving more than the receivers reported receiving, which suggests that the recipients are not just dependent, they're often underestimating how dependent they are. The money comes in, it gets absorbed, it blends into the lifestyle, and the recipient loses track of just how much of their life is being propped up. Now here's the hardest question Stanley puts on the table, and I think it's the most important one. Why do well-meaning, loving parents do this? They're not trying to sabotage their children, they're trying to help. So why does helping produce the opposite of help? Stanley's answer is surprisingly compassionate. He says most EOC givers have a particular kind of blindness. They've worked hard, they've built wealth, they look at their adult children who have similar education, similar expectations, similar life stages, but much less money. And the parents see the gap between where their children live and where their children can afford to live, and it hurts them. The parents cannot stand to watch their children live smaller than the parents lived, so they close the gap with cash. But here's what the parents don't see: the discomfort their children would have experienced, the smaller apartment, the older car, the cheaper vacations, the delayed home purchase. That discomfort was supposed to be the teacher. That discomfort is what the parents themselves endured in their own 20s and 30s, and it is the forge that made them into wealth builders. By shielding their children from that discomfort, the parents are, with love, depriving them of the exact experience that would make them financially strong. Stanley is not saying don't help your kids. He's saying help them in ways that build capacity instead of dependency. Help with education, help them start a business, help them build skills, help them buy their first modest home with a reasonable mortgage they can actually afford. But do not, he warns, fund a lifestyle. Do not enable consumption patterns they cannot sustain on their own. Do not become the invisible sponsor of a fantasy version of your child's life. Because the greatest gift you can give your children, Stanley argues, is the gift of economic self-sufficiency. And that gift requires, almost paradoxically, that you give them less. This principle scales in both directions too. It's not just about parents and children. It's about how families across generations preserve or destroy wealth. And Stanley's research shows very clearly that the more a generation consumes from the generation before it, the less likely that generation is to ever build something of their own, which raises a question that's been sitting underneath this whole book. If wealth doesn't come from high income, doesn't come from inheritance, doesn't come from education, where does it actually come from? What is the actual path? What kind of work? What kind of career? What kind of occupation produces the millionaire next door? The answer, it turns out, is not the answer most parents would want their children to hear. Chapter 7. The right occupation. Let me tell you about two men who graduated from the same high school. Same year, same small American town, same graduating class. Let's call them Mr. Denzi and Dr. Dokes. On graduation day, everyone knew who was going to be successful. It was Dr. Dokes. Well, future Dr. Dokes. He was the valedictorian, top of the class, brilliant. Teachers loved him. He was going to be a doctor. He was going places. And Mr. Denzi? Mr. Denzi was labeled by his teachers and guidance counselors as not college material. He went off to a 2-year technical school and studied data processing. At the age of 22, while his classmate was buried in organic chemistry homework, Mr. Denzi started a small business. He had no MBA. He had no impressive credentials. He had a technical skill and a willingness to work. Fast forward 30 years. Let me tell you where those two men are now. Mr. Denzi, the not college material kid, has built a thriving business. Last year, he earned approximately $160,000. He has a substantial retirement plan that has been growing with compound interest for 3 decades. He has 0 debt. Dr. Dokes, the valedictorian, also earns approximately $160,000 a year, the same income, the same small town start, but his net worth is roughly 1/6 of Mr. Denzi's. 1/6. Stop and think about what had to happen for that gap to exist. Because on paper, these two men should be equivalent. Same income today, same town, same age, but the high school dropout is 6 times wealthier than the valedictorian, and he's the one with no debt. What happened? 2 things happened. First, Mr. Denzi started 12 years earlier. While Dr. Dokes was an undergrad, then medical school, then residency, spending his 20s borrowing money, living on loans, deferring income, accumulating debt, Mr. Denzi was already earning, already saving, already investing, already compounding. Those 12 years of head start, multiplied by compound growth over 3 decades, is not a small advantage. It's a chasm. Second, and this is Stanley's deeper point, society expected different things from these two men. Dr. Dokes, because he's a doctor, is expected to live in a certain kind of neighborhood, drive a certain kind of car, send his kids to certain kinds of schools, wear certain kinds of suits, join certain kinds of clubs. His professional identity comes with a mandatory lifestyle, and that lifestyle is expensive. Mr. Denzi, the small business owner, has no such expectations. He can drive a pickup truck and nobody blinks. He can live in a modest home and nobody thinks less of him. He has professional freedom, but he also has consumption freedom. His income doesn't have to fund a performance. It can fund his family, his business, and his wealth. Stanley draws a conclusion from this story that lands harder the longer you sit with it. For high-income earners, the relationship between education and wealth accumulation is actually negative. The more advanced the degree, the less wealth, on average, a person has accumulated at similar income levels. Think about that. We tell our children that more education equals more wealth. We treat advanced degrees as the path to financial security, and Stanley's data shows the opposite, that at high income levels, doctors, lawyers, and people with graduate degrees are statistically less likely to accumulate substantial wealth than business owners with less formal education. Why? Because of the lifestyle overhead, because of the late start, because of the debt, because of the social expectations. All of it adds up, and this is, Stanley is careful to stress, not an argument against education. He's not telling anyone to drop out of college. He's pointing out something most people never see, that high income and high wealth are not the same thing, and the professions that produce the highest incomes often produce some of the lowest wealth-to-income ratios in the country. So if the path to wealth isn't the graduate degree, what is it? What do Stanley's millionaires actually do for work? The answer, in his data, is remarkably consistent. Across decades of surveys, about 2/3 of the working American millionaires Stanley interviewed were self-employed. Remember, self-employed people make up less than 20% of the total American workforce, but they make up 2/3 of its millionaires. That's not a small correlation, that's the correlation. And here's where Stanley's findings get really interesting. Because when people hear self-employed millionaire, they tend to picture a tech founder, or a venture capital-backed startup CEO, or someone in finance. That is almost never what Stanley found. What he found were welding contractors, auctioneers, rice farmers, mobile home park owners, pest controllers, coin and stamp dealers, paving contractors, scrap metal dealers, dry cleaners. Stanley uses a specific phrase for these businesses. He calls them dull normal. And I love that phrase because it captures something essential about how real wealth gets built in America. Not in the flashy industries, not in the glamorous ones, in the boring, unsexy, deeply necessary ones that most people would never tell their kids to go into. Take auctioneers. Stanley ran a whole study on them. More than 35% of full-time auctioneers in his survey had a net worth over $1 million. They live in modest neighborhoods. They are, on average, more frugal than their higher income doctor and lawyer counterparts, and they quietly, reliably build wealth decade after decade because their identity isn't tied to performing affluence. It's tied to running their business well. The lesson Stanley draws from this is not go start a welding business. The lesson is about what self-employment actually does to a person's wealth psychology. When you own the business, you think about the business. You see directly how every dollar of overhead reduces your own wealth. You understand cash flow at a visceral level because it's your cash flow. You develop an instinct for value, for cost, for return that salaried employees often never develop because they don't have to. And there's another dimension here. Self-employment produces a particular kind of relationship with money, where wealth building and work building are the same activity. You're not saving pieces of your paycheck, you're building an asset. The business itself, over time, becomes your net worth. Every hour you put in compounds, not just into this year's income, but into the long-term value of what you own. Now, Stanley is also very careful to say that self-employment is not magic. Most businesses fail. Most self-employed people never become millionaires. The path is hard. But those who succeed, those who build durable, profitable, dull, normal businesses, are vastly overrepresented among America's wealthy and wildly underrepresented in our cultural stories about what wealth looks like. There's one more thing Stanley emphasizes about occupation and wealth, and it applies whether you're self-employed or not. Because most of us will never own a welding company or a pest control business. Most of us will work for someone else or work in a profession and build our wealth in the evenings and on weekends through investing. For those people, Stanley tells the story of Mr. Martin, and it's one of my favorites in the whole book. Mr. Martin is a multimillionaire, net worth over $5 million. Here's the remarkable thing about him. His earned annual income from his job never exceeded $75,000. In his entire career, he built a $5 million fortune on a $75,000 income, not through inheritance, not through a business sale, through investing patiently, wisely, for decades. Now, because Mr. Martin's name eventually got on every investor mailing list in the country, brokers called him constantly, 3 or 4 cold calls a week, offering to manage his portfolio, and Mr. Martin developed what Stanley calls the Martin method, a single, brilliant test he uses on every single broker who calls him. He tells them, "I'm glad to hear you're a successful investor. Before I invest my money with you, I'd like you to send me 2 things. First, copies of your personal income tax returns from the last few years. Second, a list of everything that has been in your own personal portfolio for the past 3 years. If you made more money than I did from investments, I will invest with you. Here's my address." And then Mr. Martin says, the broker says, "Oh, we can't show you that." And Mr. Martin says, "Then you're likely full of baloney." And the call ends. Over decades of receiving these calls, Mr. Martin told Stanley that not a single broker, not one, ever sent him the documentation. 0. Because the broker's own wealth, in almost every case, did not come from investing. It came from commissions. They were selling him a product they themselves had not profited from. The Martin method is a brilliant little piece of wisdom, and it extends far beyond investing. The principle is, before you take financial advice from anyone, find out what that advice has actually produced in their own life, not in their pitch, not in their marketing materials, in their tax returns, in their portfolio, in their actual net worth. Advice from people who haven't done the thing they're advising you to do is almost always worth exactly what you paid for it. Mr. Martin is a reminder that you don't need to own a business to build real wealth. You need to be a student of money, a patient, careful, disciplined, skeptical student. And those traits, like all the others in this book, are not inherited. They are learned. They are practiced. They are chosen one small decision at a time over decades, which brings us to the point of pulling all of this together. Because Stanley packed this book with so many case studies and statistics that it's easy to lose the forest for the trees. So let me bring us back to the framework he offers at the very beginning, the 7 common denominators he found among the Americans who successfully build wealth. Key takeaways. The 7 denominators. After decades of research, thousands of surveys, and hundreds of face-to-face interviews, Thomas Stanley found that self-made millionaires share 7 patterns. Not all of them, not perfectly, but consistently enough that the pattern is undeniable. Here they are, and I want you to ask yourself, as we walk through each one, where you currently stand. 1. They live well below their means. Not at their means, not close to their means. Well below. Whatever they earn, they spend meaningfully less. They drive older cars, live in modest homes, buy clothes on sale, and resist the pressure to upgrade their lifestyle every time their income rises. They understand that the gap between what you earn and what you spend is the only raw material wealth is made from. Close that gap and you will never be rich, no matter how much you earn. 2. They allocate their time, energy, and money efficiently in ways conducive to building wealth. They plan. They budget, they review, they set goals, daily, monthly, yearly, lifetime. They spend roughly 8 hours a month on the boring, unglamorous work of thinking about their money, and they do it consistently across decades. They don't binge plan in January and forget by March. They treat financial planning like any other discipline, a regular, scheduled, non-negotiable practice. 3. They believe financial independence is more important than displaying high social status. This is the one that cuts the deepest for most people, because most of us, if we're honest, have made the opposite trade dozens of times. We've chosen the car we couldn't afford because of what it signaled. We've bought the house in the neighborhood that impressed our relatives. We've worn the clothes that said, "I've made it." Every one of those choices, Stanley argues, was a choice against our own financial freedom. Real wealth builders make the opposite trade. They would rather be free than appear wealthy, and so over time they become both. 4. Their parents did not provide economic outpatient care. Most self-made millionaires grew up in households where money was respected but not abundant. They learned to want things before they could afford them. They learned to work, save, and wait. They were not rescued. They were not subsidized. And that early experience of financial self-sufficiency became the muscle they built their fortunes on. 5. Their adult children are economically self-sufficient, and the pattern continues. Paws tend to raise paws. They don't fund their children's lifestyles. They help with education. They help with real opportunities, but they do not become the invisible sponsors of a life their children cannot actually afford. They let their children experience the productive discomfort that, ironically, is the gateway to real independence. 6. They are proficient in targeting market opportunities, whether in their business, their profession, or their investments. They learn to identify where demand is real, where value is underpriced, where effort compounds. They read, they study, they think about markets. They are not passive participants in the economy. They are active analysts of it. 7. They chose the right occupation, not necessarily the most prestigious, not necessarily the most glamorous, often the most boring, the ones most likely to produce millionaires. In Stanley's research were dull, normal businesses and specialized trades run by people who were willing to work hard in industries nobody writes magazine features about. They chose the occupation that fit their temperament and their goals, not the one that fit their parents' ambitions or their society's approval. Those are the 7 denominators, and if you read them carefully, you'll notice something. Not a single one is about income. Not a single one is about luck. Not a single one is about inheritance or credentials or brilliance. Every one of them is about choice. Daily, repeatable, boring choice, which means that the path the millionaire next door walked is not closed to you. It doesn't require a lottery ticket. It doesn't require a family fortune. It doesn't require an MBA. It requires a decision really, to stop performing wealth and start building it. To stop spending like the rich you see on television and start saving like the rich you'll never see at all, because they're your neighbors and you've never noticed them. Closing. I want to take you back to that Manhattan penthouse in 1980. The one with the 4 kinds of pâté and the vintage Bordeaux and the 9 decamillionaires who only ate the crackers, because that scene, when you really sit with it, is not just a funny story about researchers who misjudged their audience. It's a parable. It's the whole book compressed into a single evening. The researchers walked into that room with an idea of what wealth looked like, and the wealthy walked in and quietly, without making a scene, refused to perform that idea. They didn't want the wine. They didn't want the caviar. They wanted Budweiser and club sandwiches, because that's what they actually liked. That's what they actually were. And their refusal to play the role we all expect wealthy people to play, that refusal was the reason they were wealthy in the first place. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Not what did you think of the book? Something better. In your own life right now, where are you performing wealth instead of building it? Where is there a gap, small or large, between the person your spending is trying to signal and the person you actually want to be? And what would happen over the next 10 years if you closed that gap even slightly? If you drove the car you have a little longer? If you skipped one lifestyle upgrade a year? If you planned for an hour every Sunday night? If you budgeted? If you treated frugality not as deprivation but as freedom? Stanley's research suggests something almost radical, that the life you're secretly longing for, the freedom, the security, the quiet confidence, is not on the other side of earning more. It's on the other side of consuming less. It's closer than you think. It's available to almost anyone. And the people who've already found it are not famous, not loud, not flashy. They're just, quietly, living the life the rest of us are performing. If anything in this video resonated, The Millionaire Next Door by Thomas Stanley and William Danko is absolutely worth reading in full. The Amazon and Audible links are in the description below. They're how I keep this channel going, and I genuinely think this is one of the handful of books every single adult should read once in their life. If you found value here, subscribe. I release a new full-length book summary every week, and the next one is already in the works. Until then, take care of yourself, think carefully about what you really want, and remember that the wealthiest person in your neighborhood probably isn't who you think it is.